So I want to welcome Paul Miller here. Paul, before we start firing off questions at you, you want to explain a little bit of your background and how you came to this place where you talk and write and think about foreign policy?
Yeah. So thank you, Dan, and thank you to the Land Center and to IRD and Providence Magazine for hosting me here. I appreciate it, and thank you for your time and your interest in thinking about world affairs, international affairs, the war in Ukraine. This is important stuff, and it encourages me to see young students at seminaries understanding that you should understand something about this, so that as you go into your professional lives, perhaps working in churches or parachurch organizations, that you're able to have some wisdom to share about these kinds of issues. I came to these issues because I served in the US Army 22 years ago, including a tour of duty in Afghanistan. And if you want to shift the topic right now, let's just talk about Afghanistan, we can do that. After I served briefly in the Army, I then continued to work in intelligence. I worked for the CIA as an intelligence analyst, covering Afghanistan for a number of years after that. And then the agency detailed me over. I worked at the White House on the National Security Council staff, still working on Afghanistan. So I did about 10 years on the war there in public service. Then I went into academia, did my PhD in international relations, and I've been writing and teaching about international affairs ever since. And I just published last year my book on just war theory, which is really kind of the intersection of Christian theology with international affairs. It's thinking about how to use the lethal instrument of the state justly.
So what Paul's telling you by telling you about his background in the CIA is that he could probably kill you in 3 moves. So he's a nice guy, but be nice to him.
I was just an analyst.
And am I right in saying you got your PhD at the University of Texas?
I actually did my PhD at Georgetown.
At Georgetown, okay.
I taught at the University of Texas at Austin.
Texas.
Right, go Longhorns.
So I tried to quiz him on whether he was a Longhorn or not, and he was pretty diplomatic, but it seems like. So you mentioned your book on just war and ordered liberty, which I highly recommend. It's a great text on just war, whether you're faculty teaching on that or a student that's interested in that, doing research on that topic. Highly recommend that book. Paul, I assume many of our students are at least familiar with the term just war, or maybe not. But for those who may not be, can you articulate briefly what is just war, where it originated, how it really has shaped Christian ethics for 2,000 years?
Yeah. So actually, let me ask real fast, quick show of hands. How many of you have ever encountered just war theory in any class or context at all? Okay, yeah. And that's kind of what I've been finding as I give lectures like this, is that it's not actually well known. And so I'm happy to give an introduction to it. Just war is the church's historic answer to the question of war. Some Christians throughout history have been pacifists, where they believe it is wrong to engage in violence at all for any reason. And that's a principled position. I can respect it, but I don't think the Bible supports that, especially not for governments. On the other end of the spectrum, some Christians throughout history have argued for holy war, that you can actually wage war for God's purposes and defeat the infidel, right? I think probably none of us here fall in that category, but some Christians have argued that throughout history. So just war lies in the middle. It is the doctrine, it is a biblical doctrine that says, yes, the state may sometimes wage war and kill people, and that can be justified, but it has to meet certain criteria for it to be just and for us to justly support such a war. That's the broad idea of what just war is. Should I do more detail?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So if you've encountered just war at all, you've probably heard a checklist. And the checklist varies, but about 9 items on it. And it says that in order for a war to be just, it has to be waged with right authority. That is to say, only a state, a principle, a rightly constituted sovereign authority can wage a war. You can't, so vigilantism is out. Sorry, Avengers, right? Warlordism is out, and like things like that. Second, you have to have just cause, right? There has to be a reason for you to wage war, such as self-defense. I'll argue in a little bit, that's actually not the only just cause for waging war. There's other reasons to wage war than just self-defense. Third, you have to have right intention. And that means that if you participate in war, you still must love your enemies. And you cannot fall prey to bloodlust or revenge. And those who are governing the war, the president or others, cannot be secretly using the war to actually further their political ends, whether it be their own aggrandizement or profit or what have you. That's the justice of war. Within war, you have to fight war with proper discrimination and proportionality. Only kill the soldiers, don't kill the civilians, right? And use the minimum force necessary to accomplish your goals. And then after war, you must continue to seek peace and justice in the aftermath of war for a war to be fully just. And that often means staying and rebuilding and staying and facilitating a process of reconciliation. That's kind of the checklist version of just war, and that gives you a very basic overview. For my money, I think that the really big question is, what is justice and what is a just cause? And that's where the answers kind of go all over the map. But I'll stop there for a moment.
That's really helpful, really to think through that checklist and kind of that framework. I've heard you at times and other folks at like Providence Journal and other places use the term Christian realism when you think about foreign policy. Can you explain that a little bit, and how does that interact with just war?
So Christian realism is a term of art coined by a theologian named Reinhold Niebuhr in the early to mid 20th century. He was thinking about world politics in the run-up to World War II, during World War II, and during most of the Cold War. He wanted to be realistic about the fact of evil in the world. Back in his day, he actually started out as a socialist and a pacifist. And that was the conventional popular opinion in educated circles in 1930s America and Europe, right, to be a pacifist. After World War I, they thought war didn't have any function, and it was irrational to consider fighting any kind of war. But Niebuhr saw the coming Nazi threat, and he said, actually, we probably need to get rid of this pacifism and be prepared just in case the Nazis do what I think they're about to do. And indeed, he was right. And so he said that Christians shouldn't be pacifists and should be prepared out of love for their neighbors and even love for their enemies. They should be prepared to fight to defend liberty, order, and justice. And he coined that a Christian realist perspective. Realist because it takes the threat of evildoers seriously, but Christian because we're not fighting just for the power of the state. We're fighting for principles of justice and order and peace.
Yeah, that's really helpful. It seems like Christian realism acknowledges the reality of evil, that acknowledges the fact that, we're a fallen world. The fall seems to line up with that, rather than a sort of utopian vision. That makes a lot of sense. Let's talk about the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. There's some debate about how we got to this moment. Some folks blame the West's expansion of NATO. Others blame, on the other hand, the fact that the West has really refused to punish Putin for his repeated incursions in places like Georgia and Crimea, Chechnya. In your view, how did we get to this point where Russia invaded essentially a sovereign nation in Ukraine?
So the war in Ukraine is where a clash of two visions of world order has finally come to pass. One vision of world order is essentially the free world. Right? That's what we used to call it during the Cold War. Maybe you've heard of the term the liberal international order. I prefer the term the free world. It's a community of sovereign, independent nations that treat each other as equals. Even the big rich ones and the small, less rich ones treat each other as equals. And each country can do its own thing. Because within the free world, most of these countries are democracies of some sort or other and believe in some version of a free market economy. And for them, the world they want to live in, and I'll say the world we want to live in, is a world where rules apply, where there's, even if there's no world government, we still have something called international law that kind of regulates our behavior, and we don't invade each other, right? On the other side is a different vision of world order. And I'll call it an imperial world order. And you see particularly Russia China, and a few others, Iran, North Korea, really seem to believe in this other vision of world order, where the big, to quote Thucydides, the strong do what they will and the weak suffer as they must, right? Where the big, strong nations, they get to kind of run the show, and the weaker, smaller nations, they just have to go along with it and do whatever the big nations tell them to do. Russia's been pursuing this vision of world order for 20 plus years. Vladimir Putin, when he first came to power, did some pretty nasty things in a part of Russia called Chechnya to put down an insurgency there. He razed the capital to the ground, Grozny, killed tens of thousands of people. Then he cyber-attacked Estonia in 2007. He invaded Georgia in 2008. He invaded Crimea in 2014. He intervened in Syria 2012 to 15 and killed tens of thousands of Syrians on behalf of Bashar al-Assad. So he has engaged in campaign after campaign after campaign in his pursuit of this vision of world order, an imperial world order. And I could give you a similar list on China's side. And he's paid no consequence for it. He's actually won. He's gotten away with it. So in his mind, he's winning. He always gets away with it. Nobody does anything to stop him. So now think about a Christian realist take on this. If you're on the playground and the bully is picking on people and taking their lunch money, and he gets away with it day after day after day, how do you stop him?
And to follow up on Putin's vision, I think sometimes people confuse what Putin's vision and the old Soviet Union, but it seems like Putin is wrapping himself in this sort of Christian mantle, if you will, this cloak of the Christian savior. He's blessed by the Russian Orthodox Church. Explain that dynamic, that why this is in some ways a religious war.
Right, and this gets tricky and complicated for Christians to kind of think through this. If you listen to Putin's rhetoric, and he's not the only one who does this, he invokes a lot of Christian language. He criticizes the West for our decadence and our immorality, and he says that he and sort of Mother Russia is the sort of savior of civilization, of, he'll even say, Christian values. Now, what does Christian values look like to him? Well, it looks like authoritarianism. It looks like putting his political opponents in prison. It looks like allowing no freedom of speech or freedom of religion, no independent churches. And it looks like invading other countries and killing tens of thousands of civilians. So that doesn't look very Christian to me, but he uses the language of Christianity. And some Christians, I think, have actually sort of kind of fallen for this because they like the idea of a Christian strongman who's going to enforce our values. But if we look at what the Bible says about justice, it doesn't tell us to go enforcing our values. We can certainly champion them, and we can certainly, out of love, share them, but it never tells us to impose them at the point of a sword. So I would differ with Vladimir Putin on that.
Yeah, and at the same time, the people he's attacking and slaughtering are also Christians. You know, you think about the evangelical Christian presence in Ukraine and other Christian denominations there. So in many ways, he's attacking Christians as well. Let's talk about the Ukrainian people. I think a lot of people, before the war started, didn't give Ukraine much of a chance in terms of being able to fight for their country. Are you surprised by the way that they've been able to hold off Russia, thwart Russia? Obviously, there's the fog of war, so we don't want to be too triumphalist in saying that Ukraine is won necessarily, but the fact that Russia has, by all accounts, suffered enormous losses that they probably didn't account for. What do you make of that, and what do you attribute that to, and does that surprise you?
It did surprise me because I think I didn't think about it very carefully. I think Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, he did think about it very carefully. Let me tell you a story about Winston Churchill. In the 1940-41, the very opening days of the war, Churchill gave all these famous speeches about how the British would never surrender and they would always resist tyranny and all that. And he rallied the British people. And many people thought that he was just being romantically optimistic. And they were like, how could you possibly say that we're going to triumph when it appears Germany had just conquered all of Europe in weeks and it seemed to be unstoppable? How could Churchill be optimistic? The answer is that Churchill had spent 10 years doing his homework. He had spent 10 years reading the intelligence reports from British intelligence, counting up the number of German aircraft and boats and soldiers, and Churchill did the math and he realized Germany was physically incapable of actually invading England, conquering it, and holding it. It couldn't be done. I think Zelensky's done his homework. I think Zelensky looked at the math. 200,000 Russian soldiers sounds like a lot, but Ukraine is a country of 50 million people, and it's geographically, the largest country in Europe, next to Russia. To conquer and hold that country is almost impossible. You would need an army of 10 million people to do it. Putin obviously didn't plan for that. And so Zelensky, he understands the strategic logic that he wins as long as he doesn't surrender. It is almost impossible to, in fact, we've just seen in the last few days, Putin has come to recognize he can't conquer Kyiv. He's withdrawn from Kyiv. He's essentially given that up as a war aim, and now he's focusing only on the town of Mariupol. And so Zelensky's logic has paid off. He's correct. It's impossible for Russia to completely conquer Ukraine. That's why he was adamant, defiant, and courageous to stay.
Mm. The conflict has really seemed to have united Europe in a way that we haven't seen maybe in several decades, and really united Europe and the West in a way that hasn't been as united in a long time. Does this surprise you, the united Western response to Russia?
In some sense, I'm surprised it took this long, but now that it's happened, I am surprised at how swift and complete it's been. I thought many other steps along the way. I thought the invasion of Georgia would have done it. I thought the invasion of Crimea would have done it. The fact that it took this long, I'm sad to see that, but I'm glad it has happened. And now that it's happened quite rapidly and quite strongly. The sanctions amount to global economic war on Russia. It's a return, in a sense, to medieval siege warfare. Siege warfare where they just ring a city with an army and kind of starve them out. We're pretty close to doing that to Russia. We're not seeing the effects yet. It actually takes several months for the sanctions to really bite, but the Russian economy is going to crater. And I say that with mixed feelings because it's good to make Putin pay a cost for this, but we're going to be inflicting a pretty serious degree of poverty on the Russian people. And the longer that lasts, the more those effects compound, even intergenerationally. And we should all feel a little bit uneasy about that and hope and pray for a very swift end so we can undo the sanctions and welcome Russia back into the family of nations.
Mm. I want to return to just war theory a little bit. Obviously, Russia's invasion violates principles of just war theory. I don't think Putin went through that checklist, apparently. But let's talk about it from the perspective of the Ukrainian people who are fighting and defending their country, or maybe countries like the United States who are not directly involved but are aiding the Ukrainians. How does just war theory apply in that case?
Yeah, there's a lot of important things to say about the war in Ukraine from the just war perspective. The most obvious one is Russia's invasion is unjust. Okay, got that. For the Ukrainians, they obviously have just cause to defend their lives, their homes, their country, their independence, their sovereignty. They also have permission to seek allies, which is exactly what Zelensky's done. He's gone around the world asking, sort of demanding and cajoling other countries to help him. And it is absolutely permissible for any country to help in a just war. It's not obligatory. I want to be clear. It's not obligatory for us to do so, but it is permissible for us to aid the Ukrainians in any way consistent with prudence, and that's an important qualifier. And so that means giving weapons to the Ukrainians, which we've been doing a lot of, giving money to the Ukrainians, helping the Ukrainian refugee camps, and the sanctions, the global economic war on Russia. All are I think, are just actions. The Ukrainians themselves on the front lines have to fight with discrimination and proportionality. It's not too hard since they're fighting within their own country. There's no Russian civilians around, and they can treat the Russian invading force quite harshly. But once they take captives, have to treat them with respect. More to be said there, but yeah, good place to start.
You have, like many others, have urged the U.S. to do what we can to arm the Ukrainians, and we've done quite a bit, but also avoid direct conflict with Russia, such as things like a no-fly zone. Can you explain why you think it's prudent for us to do as much as we can to aid the Ukrainians, but not get directly involved with Russia.
Yeah, thank you for picking up on that. I just said do everything we can within the limits of prudence, and that's a super important qualifier. Part of just war is to fight it wisely and prudently, and fight it with a reasonable chance of success, and fight it proportionately. You don't use a nuclear weapon to take out a sniper, right? You need to kind of calibrate your response to the degree of threat. And you also don't want to escalate a war unnecessarily and cause more harm than good you would achieve, right? This is all about sort of, ethical, ethical reasoning. So if we apply that to the war in Ukraine, it is good for us to help the Ukrainians fight their war and win and defend their homes, their lives, their independence. Should we do anything that escalates the war or expands the war or makes the war bigger, longer, or more lethal than it otherwise would be? That, I think, is imprudent and possibly immoral for us to do that. And if the United States or another NATO country directly intervenes in the conflict and becomes a belligerent in the conflict, if we put troops on the ground and start shooting Russian soldiers, if we fly planes in the sky and shoot down Russian airplanes, we're declaring World War III. I really am afraid that that's what it amounts to. I don't see a way that we could get involved halfway or partway or just a little bit. Once we're involved, it's sort of almost like a free fire situation where the Russians will understand that they can shoot back at us, and by the logic of escalation, we will be drawn into a general war, and we call that World War III, which would very likely turn into a nuclear war. That's why I say prudence counsels that we limit our involvement to helping the Ukrainians and the economic sanctions. But direct military intervention is likely to cause more harm than good.
Some folks have said, in some ways Putin has somewhat of an upper hand because he has nuclear weapons, and that has kind of allowed him to do and get away with things because people are afraid of direct confrontation. But obviously, how do you talk to people who sort of raise that?
We have them too, and that's the reason why Putin is very unlikely to invade the next country over. The whole point here is that Ukraine is not in NATO, and that's why Putin felt he could get away with it. Every other country in the region around there, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Bulgaria, Romania, they are in NATO, and they're protected by our security guarantee and therefore our nuclear weapons and our military. And Putin knows that, and I think it's very unlikely that Putin's going to invade the next country, particularly when he can't even take Ukraine, right? So he's not about to engage on a blitzkrieg all across Europe. We can relax about that. Does that leave a gray zone for countries that are not in NATO, such as Ukraine, such as Georgia, or the Central Asian republics, Kazakhstan, for example? Does that leave them out on a limb? What it does say is that they may want to seek other forms of security guarantees, whether that means building up their own militaries, as much of Eastern Europe has done, and as Ukraine has done for the past 8 years, which is why they've been able to fight back so successfully, or maybe form a new form of alliance amongst themselves. That's another possibility. There's other options and alternatives here. I know maybe some people's instinct is, we, the superpower, the United States, we've got to do something. That's not always the answer. Sometimes we can encourage others to have their own ideas, to take action to solve the problems. There's a problem right here, right now, that Ukraine lacks a security guarantee. Maybe they will make it into NATO. It's hard to see how that will happen right now, but maybe there's other options we can allow others to put forward first.
It appears from all reports that Russia is committing some pretty egregious war crimes in Ukraine. Will they be held account for that? And if so, what would that even look like to hold them accountable? People have said, we need another, after this is over, another Nuremberg trials or all that. But is there even a possibility of any kind of accountability for Putin on some of these things?
So when we talk about war crimes, interestingly, quite often the conversation focuses on an individual act, like the massacres in Bucha or elsewhere, Bucha. And yes, that is a war crime. But the original war criminals, the Nazis who were put on trial at the Nuremberg trials, one of the war crimes they were charged with was the crime of aggression invading another country is a war crime. Right? So has Russia committed war crimes? Yes. It invaded another country. That's a war crime. So number one, I just want you to come away with that. Putin's a war criminal because he invaded the invasion of a sovereign country. Then the other individual acts, massacring civilians and soldiers who were already captive, that is also a war crime. The only way to hold them accountable is to win the war. There's no examples in history of victors being held accountable for war crimes. There really isn't. I think that's true. And there is a 0% chance that any Russian will stand trial at The Hague, at the International Criminal Court, for any of their actions. That's not going to happen. I can give you a long lecture why, but great powers, they just won't give up their people, and we're not going to invade looking for the general who ordered this or that massacre. So that's not going to happen. The best and only way to hold them accountable is to win the war. And that will be a form of justice for the Ukrainian people, and maybe the only justice we see against the Russians, unless the Russian people take it in their own hands and impose their own version of justice on Vladimir Putin. And that, again, would be a form of ending this war that I would pray for.
So in your view, how do you see this conflict ending? Do you feel there's a possibility for some peace agreement? No, there's ongoing negotiations. How do you see it ending?
So a rule about peace negotiations is that they're mostly for show, and they don't make any progress until both sides no longer believe they have anything more to gain on the battlefield, right? Until that happens, they're just talking for show to kind of feel out each other's positions. There's not going to be any progress. And right now, I think the Ukrainians probably believe they have a lot to gain by continuing to fight because they're winning. And they just won the battle for Kyiv. I think they're about to win the battle for, Kharkiv. And the Russian side, I think they believe that they're going to win the battle for Mariupol. And so both sides think, we've got to keep fighting. I can still keep gaining things on the battlefield. So don't expect much from the peace negotiations for now. Give it a few more weeks or months. We'll see how the battlefield changes. How does this war end? I could see a 10-day, 10-month, and 10-year scenario. The 10-day scenario is essentially a mutiny by the Russian army in the field, riots or protests in the streets of Moscow and other cities, which was happening, and a coup by Russian generals or oligarchs. And that 10-day scenario, it's been 10 days since the beginning, and it's still 10 days because we're not making any progress on it, but it involves essentially one more casualty, and that's Vladimir Putin. And if that happens, I could envision the war ending very quickly with a complete Ukrainian victory and a new Russian leader saying, it was a mistake, we blame the dead guy, and we're going to get out of there. I hope and pray that happens. Okay. The 10-month scenario is the negotiated peace, where over the course of the summer and the fall, the sanctions begin to bite, the Russian economy collapses, but the Russian army successfully takes Mariupol in the southeast, creating a land bridge between Donbass and Crimea, and then they can approach the negotiating table and will reach a unsatisfying but durable peace, where they actually make concessions on both sides. Maybe the Ukrainians actually concede some territory in exchange for recognition of their independence or something like that. I could envision that happening in 10 months. 10 years, if the negotiations fail, this turns into a decade-long insurgency, like the Soviet-Afghan War, or like the American-Afghan War, where the Ukrainians revert to insurgency tactics, we continue to arm and fund them, and this grinds on year after year after year, and the Ukrainians probably win that war, but what a victory, right? It's a Pyrrhic victory. Their entire country is ruined. So the shorter version is the best, and it saves the most lives, and it also ends with the best victory for the Ukrainians.
We're going to have time for questions. I have a few more questions here for Paul, but if you have any questions, I believe we have a mic, and we can go, and so you may want to be thinking of a few at the end. I've heard some foreign policy folks say that the outcome of this war will set the tone for the rest of the century. Do you believe that? Do you believe that the response of the West to Russia's aggression in Ukraine will deter others like China, for instance, from invading Taiwan? How do you feel about that?
So I earlier characterized the war as a conflict of visions of world order. So yes, I very much believe this. This war is one battle in a larger Cold War, essentially, for what kind of world we're going to live in for the foreseeable future. World order is a culture that obtains among states of the world. And when the biggest, strongest states reflect our values, then the world reflects our values. And we get to live in a world of relative freedom, where we can travel internationally, we can do missionary work, we can do development work, aid work, charity work, we can do foreign exchange. Many of you, I think, perhaps are not from the United States. You're able to travel internationally for education because we live in a relatively free world order. We take that for granted because we and our parents, our grandparents, all grew up in this kind of world. We have no immediate experience of anything else that's different from it. The fish doesn't know what water is because it's spent its entire life in the ocean, right? We don't really know what it's like to not be in a relatively free world order. I'm afraid we might find out if Russia wins this war because we've been on a trajectory of decline. The free world order has been crumbling around the edges for a few decades. The peak was probably around 2005, right? But especially after the collapse in Afghanistan and now this war, I feel that the deterioration is accelerating. And if Russia gets away with this, if they win, if we allow them to win, then what lesson will China take? How long will Taiwan remain independent? How long will South Korea remain independent? How long will the Middle East remain relatively free of Iran's influence? I fear what the world will look like in 20 to 50 years if Russia wins this war. I think the stakes are more than just Ukrainian independence and sovereignty. The stakes are, what will the world look like over 20 to 50 years?
You mentioned Afghanistan. Do you believe that the collapse in Afghanistan and our disastrous withdrawal was a key factor in Putin's invasion of Ukraine? Do you think Putin saw that and said, maybe the West isn't as strong as they think they are, or did that not have much of an impact, do you think?
It may have affected the timing, but I don't want to overplay that too much. If you look back at Putin's statements, he's made it pretty clear for a long time that this was his goal, that in his way of saying, reunifying the Russian peoples, including Ukraine, has been a goal of his for a decade plus. And remember, he invaded Ukraine first in 2014 to take Crimea, and this has been a long developing plan of his. And I think we saw the earliest signs that he was massing his army on Ukraine's border over a year ago, in January, February of 21. So when Afghanistan collapsed in August 21, it's not as if Putin suddenly got a new idea, hey, why don't I invade Ukraine? It may have signaled to him that the timing was ripe because, in his view, American resolve was very weak and NATO was in disarray. Afghanistan was a NATO operation. NATO was in disarray and probably too preoccupied with putting the alliance back together and reforming our own defense establishments to do anything meaningful about Ukraine. So it may have helped that way.
Anybody have any questions? I have a few more for Paul, but you have a question? So I'm going to restate the question. The question was, it seems like there's some evidence of use of chemical weapons by Russia in Ukraine. Is that a red line for NATO and for the U.S.?
So I have what may be a contrarian, possibly unpopular take on this. I think the answer is no. Right? President Obama famously said the use of chemical weapons in Syria would be a red line, and he implied the United States would do something if Assad used chemical weapons, which he then went and did, and we did nothing about it. Why is the use of chemical weapons worse than the use of bullets or machetes, for that matter? Right? The Rwandan genocide was carried out with machetes. Are those people any less dead than those people killed with chemical weapons? So I actually don't think that the particular weapon used to commit a war crime or a massacre or carry out a war matters that much. Yeah, it's kind of ghastly and horrible, but again, I don't want to wrongly weight human life by the method by which they were killed. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Then add in the prudential criteria. We don't want to spark World War III. Therefore, I really don't think it's appropriate for us to get involved as a response to potential chemical weapons use.
Any other questions? The question was, how do those of us who are Christians watch this unfold, and how should we pray?
So I would be reading the imprecatory Psalms. There are psalms where the psalmist prays that the Lord would defeat his enemies, break the teeth of the wicked. And I think sometimes we have an instinct to spiritualize these psalms and immediately apply it to the enemies of sin, death, hell, the devil, right? And of course, we can do that. But let's not pretend that we don't have real worldly enemies. And I think it's I thought through this very carefully when I was deployed to Afghanistan. How do I pray about this war? How do I love my enemies? How do I love Al-Qaeda? And how do I pray about this war? And I came to the conclusion that yes, it is entirely good and appropriate for us to pray that justice be done, which means the wicked, the plans of the wicked are defeated, and that in the normal course of things means our side wins the battle, the real physical military battle. Yes, so we should pray those imprecatory psalms against the Russian army and against Vladimir Putin specifically. As we do so, let's also be cautious not to fall into a crusader mindset, and keep in mind that our truest enemies is not flesh and blood, right? So we can recognize kind of two levels of enemies and pray against both while understanding the distinction between them. Does that make sense?
That's a great answer. We have time for some more questions, but I have a few myself. This conflict and also the Afghanistan collapse, and obviously the ongoing Syria conflict have created the largest displacement of human beings really since World War II. Humanitarian. I think I read where almost 3 million Ukrainians are displaced. How is that? Number one, how is that going to reshape world events? And number two, as Christians, how do we think about that? I know as Southern Baptists, we have a lot of folks on the ground in Poland and other places really helping to come alongside the Ukrainian refugees, through the IMB, through disaster relief. But how should we be thinking about this great displacement of humans?
Yeah. So help the sojourner, right? It's good for us to be aware of the needs of the homeless, the sojourner, those who've been victims of war, the orphans, the widows out there. Ways to help include giving your money to these charitable organizations. There are a lot of these refugees who are coming to the United States. Some temporarily, some permanently. 100,000 or more Afghans and who knows how many Ukrainians. The time to help them, the time to begin thinking about how to help them isn't today. It was actually 6 months ago. And I'm learning this because I've been trying to get my church involved in helping the Afghan refugee situation. It's actually quite a long process. There's a lot of paperwork. You have to do training. You have to prepare your community to care for those who come to be near you, to be in your neighborhood. It is a long process. So if you're discovering that you have a heart for helping refugees right now, don't give up when Ukraine is no longer in the headlines. Keep up with that process, because I promise you there's going to be another crisis. Maybe it's Nigeria, right? Maybe it's North Korea. Maybe it's Syria again. I don't know what it'll be, but if you have a heart for refugees, start learning about it, start getting your church involved, start doing those training and the paperwork now so that you are ready to help the day of when the next crisis happens.
And there's ways to get training through Send Relief, through the North American Mission Board, who's partnered with World Relief to do some really great training. I think we've actually hosted some training here on campus here. Any other questions? I have a few more, but yeah, let's go in the back there. Will the sanctions the West is putting on Russia affect the Russian perception of the West in a way that the Treaty of Versailles did with Germany between World War I and World War II?
I don't know, and that's beyond our control. I'm a parent. I got 3 kids. Whenever I have to be a dad and have some moment of discipline, I know it's on me to ensure that they have a consequence, but I don't know how they're going to respond to it. They can respond with repentance, or they could respond with rejection and bitterness, right? But it's still on me to make sure there's a consequence. And it's a dereliction of duty if I don't. Similarly, I don't know how Russia corporately will respond to the economic sanctions or to aiding the Ukrainian military, but it's sort of not on us to decide beforehand, to predict beforehand how they're going to react, and then to choose whether or not to do it, right? I think that it's actually important for us, certainly for the Ukrainians, to do as much as we can. And if Russia, again, I'm speaking corporately, if they decide to respond one way as to the other, that's kind of on them to respond that way. The moral burden is on them. That's my best answer. It's a longer conversation about trying to understand how other countries respond to this. Will they perceive it as a provocation, an escalation or not? But I'll stop there.
Any other questions? I saw some other folks with their hands up. I don't want to miss anybody. With the flood of information coming across our timelines about the war, how do we know what is credible and what is not? Is this one of the first wars we've really experienced via social media? Maybe others, but it seems like we're getting all this stuff in real time. Great question. How do we be discerning in our intake of that?
And you've done some writing on, you want to?
Well, sure. Although you're the foreign policy expert, so I think we have to just be, James says about being quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. I think we have to wait before we react, or post or things, whatever. I think also just a variety of sources and sources that are credible. Some, people who are reporters who are on the ground, reporting back what they're actually seeing. I think it is helpful. And guarding against, I think, either triumphalism on the one hand, saying, we tend to read it through our perspective. So, I want Ukraine to win. So you can easily get a mindset where you read everything through that and you don't get proper information. Or on the other side, if you are negative about a lot of things, you can sort of color it through that lens. So really, it seems like just being discerning about what you're following, who you're reading. Mainstream journalists who are on the ground doing really good work. CNN at times can lean left. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. I do think they're doing some pretty good work on the ground. They have a lot of journalists on the ground reporting back. Fox has some great journalists on the ground as well. So I think kind of reading from people firsthand reports and people and following people who have a history of being sort of balanced and not knee-jerk about things, I think during a time like this is helpful. What would you say?
Yeah, I think
follow Paul Miller, basically, and then you'll be fine.
Ditto to all that. I think a multiplicity of sources is always good. So don't just rely on one newspaper, one TV channel. In fact, rely on 0 TV channels. TV's awful.
Yes.
But read a multiplicity of newspapers or listen to podcasts. And I want to echo, I think that whatever hang-ups we might have about mainstream journalism and its reporting domestically, especially on culture war stuff, I think that doesn't really have as great of effect on international reporting, right? So I think the New York Times does a pretty good job reporting on the war in Ukraine, and CNN does a pretty good job, and yes, Fox and all the others do a pretty good job reporting on some international events. And so you can have some confidence that what they're reporting is pretty good. You pick up on what you said about misinformation. We are all absolutely victims of a smashingly successful Ukrainian propaganda operation, and I love it. It's wonderful, right? So the things you've heard about Ukraine, like the ghost of Kiev, the pilot, he probably doesn't exist, but enjoy it, right? And the stories about the Ukrainian grandmothers putting flour, probably not true, but just enjoy it because they're fun stories. So understand that a lot of what you're getting with the more kind of poetic or romantic stories of the Ukrainians might not be strictly true. But what you are hearing about the war crimes by the Russians, I mean, that's been reported by multiple outlets. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's a Ukrainian misinformation op. I think there's something there. Yeah,
one thing I would say too, I've seen a few folks, not many, but a few, there's a lot of distrust right now, for good reason. Our institutions many of them have failed us in many ways, media, all across the board. But you can easily slip into this sort of contrarianism as your only lens, and so you don't believe anything. And if CNN reports it, I'm not going to believe it. New York Times reports it, I'm never going to believe it, even on things like war. And I think that's a little dangerous. I think we have to guard against that. as well. We had I'm going to go back here. You had a question, and then we'll. So Christian realism, what's the definition of evil? That could be a whole nother Land Center luncheon. I don't know if we'd have a good enough turnout, but let's talk about evil over Chick-fil-A. But
So let me take that question more politically and less theologically, right? Because
Yeah.
How do you recognize evil theologically? I'll let you answer that one. But if you're talking about sort of like, as a Christian concerned about politics, where do I recognize kind of political forms of evil? I think a good touchstone, a good maybe ethical concept touchstone here is human dignity. Where you see humans flourishing, that's a place where justice is happening. Where you see humans undermined, crushed, murdered, enslaved, denigrated, that's where the society that does that is evil or is unjust in some way. That's maybe the first, most basic answer. It's easy to recognize the evil of the Nazis, right? And I actually say, I think that we're pretty close to that in a country like North Korea, right? Not that they're invading other countries, but that the entire nation is one big concentration camp, right? The government of North Korea has essentially enslaved over 20 million people. It is mass enslavement, and I think that's evil. I think the government of North Korea is evil, right? China is far richer, and so their tyranny wears a softer face, but it is still quite tyrannical. And the things they do to their population, particularly out west in Xinjiang, that's evil, right? The concentration camps with the Uyghurs is evil. I'll even say that their surveillance state, they have the most sophisticated, most pervasive surveillance of any in world history. And so evil, right? And invading other countries is evil, and war crimes are evil. I'm giving you illustrations, anecdotes. These are pictures more than a definition. It's kind of a you know it when you see it, right? If something looks like genocide or war crimes or ethnic cleansing, and it walks like it, and it talks like it, then yeah, that's political evil, and you should understand we have a responsibility to at least say something about that.
That's a really good question, by the way, and thank you for giving us some framework for that, Paul.
I think it is always appropriate to speak the truth. So if what you're suggesting is that we give truth a megaphone and advertise Russia's war crimes, advertise Putin's authoritarianism, advertise his incompetence, I think that would be appropriate and permissible for us to do that. Particularly since they're not getting the truth, right? Russian media is controlling what they hear. The Russian people clearly don't understand what's quite actually going on in Ukraine. I do want to be careful. I think we ought to be careful about saying that we should rile up the Russian people to overthrow their government. That is a very tricky thing when the government is a nuclear-armed superpower. We actually want to allow Putin a pathway out, right? If we start saying we're out for regime change in Russia, we want the Russian people to overthrow Putin, even if we actually do want that, saying so loudly and publicly makes it much harder to get to the 10-month scenario, right? Gets it much harder to allow Putin any room for maneuver or any negotiations. So if we do anything like that, it ought to be real secret, and we ought to not admit it. So there's where we are.
Good question. Where's the incompetence of the Russian army coming from? Why are they more incompetent than we might have thought they would have been?
Yeah. So I've noted over the last 20 years, oftentimes people will look at China and with envy, like their system is so efficient and they can make decisions rapidly. They don't have to put up with Congress, and couldn't we just be authoritarians for a day? Wouldn't that be wonderful? It turns out authoritarianism is actually inefficient and incompetent, because another word for authoritarianism is groupthink. You have one guy or a group of people who make all the decisions, and everyone's afraid of them, and no one will challenge them, and no one will give them bad news, and no one will challenge their thinking. Pluralistic societies, we're constantly arguing, constantly debating, which means we're constantly challenging each other. And so whatever decision comes out at the other end of a much longer process is a much sounder decision. This is actually one of the reasons why the Allies won World War II, right? Hitler did the same thing. People say, well, the Nazis conquered Europe in 6 weeks. Then they destroyed their country in a couple of years. There's a stupidity behind authoritarianism and inefficiency. And here's an anecdote. The Russian convoys going into Ukraine were breaking down in part because their tires were rotting. Why were their tires rotting? Their tires were rotting because they were sitting in their depots for too long without being driven or used or anything. What we do in our military is we have people drive the trucks every couple of days to make sure the tires are rotated and they don't sit in the same place in the sun and the sun doesn't rot the tires. Well, the Russians, this just wasn't a priority for them. It's hard for me to express what attentiveness to detail is required to keep a massive machinery like an army moving. And to have that kind of level of competence requires ingenuity. It requires initiative. It requires a belief in your cause. And when the Russians, ruled by an authoritarian regime, lack initiative, they lack responsiveness, they lack morale, they lack belief in their cause, they're not going to drive the trucks around every couple of days just for maintenance, so then when they invade a country, they break down on the side of the road. That's what we're looking at here. We're looking at the fruits of unjust governance on the battlefield.
That's really good. I think we have time for one more question, and then I got a couple to close us out back here.
Bureaucratic inertia is one of our greatest enemies right here. I support the sanctions. I think the sanctions are good, and it is appropriate for us to impose them. I support lifting the sanctions the day the war is over, right? The day we win. And I'm almost guaranteed that won't happen because our government works very slow, and it'll take months and months to lift the sanctions. So I think that we should be supportive of the sanctions, and the day the war is over, we need to say, time to lift them, so that we don't impose unnecessary hardship and poverty on the Russian people.
So I want to close with, we're going to wrap up here, but I want to close with a couple kind of practical questions for students. Some advice for our audience of students here. If you could help shape their view of foreign policy, of war, of the world as a faithful evangelical Christian, what would you say? How should Christians, in a broad sense, think about the world?
Many of us are often drawn to individual causes, stopping human trafficking, or getting rid of landmines, or ending world poverty, or something like that. And those are all good, commendable things. Most of them are only possible in a world where the major nations of the world care about that stuff. If the major nations, if Russia and China run the world, you won't be able to make a dent in human trafficking. You can make a dent in human trafficking because we live in a relatively free world order where you can be an advocate, where you can be an activist, where you can travel and meet people and organize things to fight human trafficking. So Genesis 2:15, tend and keep the garden. That is true of all of our creative labors, all of our creative labors. And we're used to thinking of that at the individual level, the family level, the workplace, but I want to apply that at the international level. The garden of world order needs maintenance, and we need to tend and keep the functions and systems and processes of ordered liberty among nations.
So last question. If there's a student here saying, man, I really want to be Paul Miller when I grow up. If someone was interested in a career in public service, whether in the Foreign Service or as a candidate for office or serving in a role at a think tank or an NGO or something like that, what advice would you give someone who aspires to that?
You should take advantage of the best resources you have here at Southwestern by going to every event by the Land Center for Cultural Engagement.
Man, that was just like a fastball right down the middle.
And get plugged into the network of Christians who are thinking and working on these things. Consider an internship or a job in public service in Washington, D.C. or elsewhere. Work at the state level, for crying out loud. We need more people at the state level where you can actually get stuff done. So maybe consider going down to Austin and working there and getting involved in public policy there first. And then if you have more questions, I'm happy to talk to you about career stuff. Come on down to me, we'll talk afterwards.
And we will have the Land Center can actually connect you to internships at a lot of these different places, both in DC and in Austin, with a lot of these kinds of organizations. So if you're interested in that, you can talk to me or some other folks here. But why don't we all give a hand to Paul Miller for joining us today.